I'm Abby Landry, Director of Libraries here at Northwestern State University, and I want to welcome all of you to the Fleming Thomas Lecture Series. Fleming Thomas, for those of you who didn't know him, was the library director for several years until his untimely passing. And one of the things that was a great love of his heart was doing events like this for the university, for the students, and for the community. So in honor of his memory, we do this lecture series. The great thing about tonight is we've got a fabulous guest. Mary Manhein, and fortunately, I don't have to say all that, that's right up there, from LSU, has an MA in Anthropology, has been on the faculty at LSU for more than 28 years, has 30 years experience in forensic anthropology, has worked on hundreds of forensic cases, conducted workshops for law enforcement personnel, including Scotland Yard. She has published 3 nonfiction books, The Bone Lady, Trail of Bones, and Bone Remains, which tells stories about her experiences as a forensic anthropology, and I've read most of them, so I can personally tell you they're fabulous books. She's also worked on 2 fictions, novels, Floating Souls and Murder in the Cities of the Dead. I'm not going to talk anymore because we're here to hear Mary. So, Mary Manhein.
Wow, what a wonderful turnout. Hello, Natchitoches and Northwestern. I'm from this area. I'm from North Louisiana. I grew up in the Shreveport area, Ida, Vivian. I graduated from North Caddo High. People in South Louisiana don't understand my accent. I've been down there 40-something years and they still don't understand me. They think I'm from up north or something. I can't get that. But thank you all, Anna especially, for inviting me here tonight. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I do, how we do what we do, all the many different things that we've been involved with over the years. It is so great to see you all. Northwestern, in the 1960s, when I was quite young, 10, not really, but we used to come down to Northwestern to concerts. I mean, we were children of the 60s. The horrible hairdos, I mean, men wearing things called pork chops. What were we thinking? Bell-bottom pants, ugliest clothes and hairdos, but the best music ever written came from the 60s. We know that, don't we? Woo! Well, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a comedian. Go figure. I was not good at it. I was not funny. I would try to start telling a joke, and I would think of the punchline, start laughing, so I never could finish the joke. I was just awful. I thought it was funny. No one else did. But when my husband and I transferred down to Baton Rouge, I matriculated as a freshman at LSU. I put my younger son in kindergarten, and I started to college. And I was going to be an English teacher. I always loved English. I love English literature. I love to diagram sentences. Nobody likes to diagram sentences anymore. I was going to write a book, I diagram. I don't think anyone would have bought that one. But on the way to getting a degree in creative writing in English, I took a course in anthropology and absolutely fell in love with it. I was a senior. I was graduating, and I started graduate school after that, and then I just took over. I've been doing this for over 30 years down at LSU. I had to beg them to let me teach when I first began. But I was an anthropologist before anthropology was as cool as people think it is today. Before CSI. CSI New York, CSI Timbuktu, Miami, all of these things. Bones. I know there's some fans in the audience, so you wouldn't be here. And they're fun, aren't they? I get emails, phone calls, even snail mail letter from all over the country. Miss Manhein, I want to do what they do on CSI. And I write back and say, so do I. Can you get me the gig? Can you get me the clothes? Not the ones, the blouses down to here, high heels up to here. I can assure you, this is as good as it gets. We never, ever, ever wear those kinds of clothes into the woods. We come out of the woods with torn up knees. I've torn up both my knees in the woods on forensic cases. Poison sumac all over us one day, poison ivy, you name it, bee stings. So it's not at all like it is on TV, but it's fun, isn't it? And so I'm going to talk to you tonight about what we really do in forensic anthropology, some of the serious things, some of the tragic things, some of many of the things, though, that make our job worthwhile. And I am director of what's called the FACES Lab at LSU. It stands for Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services. I am also director of what's called the Louisiana Repository for Unidentified and Missing Persons Information Program. And that has to do with unidentified and missing persons in Louisiana. So I'll speak to that in just a few minutes. Our primary role, our primary goal as forensic anthropologists is to identify the dead. That's what we do. If a body is found somewhere and they don't know who the person is, if bones are found out in the woods, we're on call to go out and help these people, try to figure out who these people are, what happened to these people, and the profile, age, sex, ancestry, time since death, what we call post-mortem interval, all of those variables play a role in figuring out who that person is. We look at the trauma that happened to that person also, and we testify in court about that trauma. So we offer a service to Louisiana that has grown exponentially over the last 20 years. And we compare ante-mortem and post-mortem records to try to get an identification, and we'll also take DNA. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but this is what we do. On our way to trying to determine whether or not this is a forensic case, the first question we have to answer is whether or not the remains are human. In the past, law enforcement agents would travel all the way from Shreveport, all the way from somewhere else in northeast Louisiana down to Baton Rouge with a bone that someone had found in his or her garden or yard, and they needed to know if it was human or not. I mean, have you ever dug in a garden or something and found a bone, and just for a second you wondered, could that be somebody? I mean, we're curious. We're mammals. We are curious animals. We want to figure out the puzzle, right? And that's what makes forensic anthropology and these programs today so intriguing to people. So the first question we ask is whether or not the bones are human. Now those same law enforcement agents can email us a photo of those bones, and we can tell them instantly, if it's complete enough, whether or not it's an animal or a human animal. A great story goes along with that. And we love to get these stories that don't deal with humans because we deal with so many tragic things. A man was working in his backyard one day. The key to this story is that he had just bought the house. The backyard did not drain very well, and so he was digging a little trench to try to make the backyard drain better. He got down about 2 feet, and he came across a small wooden box about 2 feet long, a foot wide, and a foot deep. And across the top of it was a plastic label tape that read, Patsy Liu Bei, sis. Well, what did he do? He opened the box. I can't tell you how many teenagers I query regarding this, and they say, no, Ms. Manhein, we'd just leave that box right where it is. We'd go back in our house and never think another thing about it. No, they wouldn't. We're going to open the box. He opened the box, and inside he found a small pile of fragile skeletal remains. He didn't know what they were, so he did the right thing. He called law enforcement. So by the time I got there, the sheriff's office was there, the police department was there, all the neighbors in town were there, all the news media were there, and the one thing I could think of was, I hope I know what's in the box, because we don't want to look foolish, do we, in front of that many people. So I looked at the tiny little bones, and the little thigh bone, the femur, was only about this long, and it was perfectly formed. It had the little head that goes into your hip joint and the little distal condyles that fit in the knee. And I knew immediately, because it was completely formed, that indeed it was not human. Because if it were human, it wouldn't have the head. It wouldn't have the condyles on the end of it. It'd just be this nice little shaft. So I was so relieved that it wasn't human. I said, I know it's not human, but I think it's a cat or a dog, and I'll tell you exactly what it is when I get back to my laboratory and look at my comparative collection. So I went back to the lab. It was a little dog. I called the law enforcement people. I said, it's a little dog. And they were happy. News media, not so happy. It must have been a slow day. You know how they are these days. They're getting worse and worse, aren't they? Must have been a slow day, though, for the local newspaper, because in the next day in the newspaper, there was a 2-column article on this little dog that I said was a very old little dog. He had arthritis. And there was a 2-column article on that little dog. The whole thing could have ended there. The article made its way where? To the original owner of the house. She now lives in Mississippi, and she called me. She said, this is just the greatest story. She said, you were so right. It is a dog. It was our toy Manchester. She lived to a ripe old age of 17. We loved her so much that we gave her a human name, Patsy Liu Bei, and we called her Sis. But she said, that's not really the reason I'm calling. The reason I'm calling is if they move over about 3 more feet and start digging again, they're going to find Bitsy. You can't make up this stuff. Truth is always stranger than fiction, so it's always wonderful. And we get a lot of cases. We probably get 20 or 30 a year that are non-human. But it's just as important to tell someone that they're not human than if they are. It's just as important for law enforcement to know. And you can see here, these are just a couple of 3 or 4 bones. This is the femur of a human. And then you have another animal. I can't read it. It's a bear. I mean, I think that's a bear, a dog, and a deer. And then there's a human hand over here, a partial hand. And you can see how close the femur of the human is to the other animals. What if this part is missing, though? If it's all there, it's easy to tell. Anyone can tell who's had a little anatomy. But if it's broken or if it's in splintered pieces, think about the World Trade Center. 3,000 people. There were all kinds of animals in the World Trade Center buildings. There were restaurants there that had all kinds of food in them. You know, think about that. So you need to know the anatomy. There are, almost 1,000 people who are still unaccounted for from the World Trade Center. So you need to be able to tell animal versus non-human animal versus human animal. On the far right, you see a partial human hand, and then the forepaw of a bear. This one came from northeast Louisiana, partial forepaw of the bear. That is the closest thing you will ever see to a human hand. They're very similar to a human hand. This was found in the woods in northeast Louisiana. It had tissue all over it. It had been badly damaged by some other animal. And so they needed to know if it was human or not. And we were able to tell them it was similar, but it was not human. So these things are important. Wildlife and fisheries, we work with them sometimes, especially when you're dealing with things that are killed, animals that are killed out of season. They need to know all these things. So forensic anthropology can be fairly broad. One thing we do is field recovery. We go, as I mentioned earlier, we go in all kinds of crazy places. I've been up on buildings that were still burning. If you read one of my stories in The Bone Lady, you will find that's a pretty amusing story about what happened to me then. We go out into the woods. This is along a river in Louisiana. What you're looking at, this is some of my team and some firemen, what you're looking at here is an example of a case of a car that had been found 20 years after it went into the water, 20 years. How was it found? Well, here's a road, South Louisiana. Picture this road, and then there's a curve, a 90-degree angled curve. And in that curve, right there at that apex, is a river. A young man drove off that road into that river, and he got out of his truck, but his truck floated on down the river. And so the firemen and others went back the next day looking for his truck to help him. He really wasn't injured. They found his truck later, but that day, in that same place where he went in, they found the car of a man who had been missing for 20-plus years, and he was still in that car. So we used our archaeological techniques that we use for many different things and excavated that car, and his remains are in there. He had been missing for 20-plus years. No one knew where he was. No one knew what happened to him. Many, many speculations about what happened to him. So sometimes these things are found simply by accident, simply by accident. When we have recovered remains and taken them to our lab, the first thing we do is, again, create that profile or develop that profile, age, sex, ancestry, time since death, trauma, what happened to that person. For children up until the age of 18, we look at the growth and development of their teeth because that can help us a lot. They may not be erupted, but the growth and development of a child's teeth, pretty much standard, you might say, more genetically controlled than the growth and development of the rest of his or her body, because diet and other things can impact the growth and development of the long bones and the other bones, but your teeth are more genetically controlled. After the age of 18, generally speaking, we look at the breakdown of the human skeleton. You're all breaking down as we sit here. That's just part of life. After the age of 18, we look at changes throughout the skeleton that document the age of an individual. This is part of the hip bone. This is called the auricular surface that articulates with the sacrum. This is the hip bone of a 20-year-old. Nice and sharp edges, all billowy, begins to break down. These are standards that have been developed by looking at cadavers of known age. The persons who studied this said, oh, look at this 20-year-old. Looks very different from this 30-year-old, different still from a 40-year-old. So they've looked at persons of known age and developed these standards that help us in forensic anthropology to figure out how old someone is. And this, again, is a 69-year-old. All of this is broken down. You have irregular borders. I'm somewhere between here and here, and it's none of your business where. That's not my hip. But we all break down. That's just part of nature. And all over your skeleton, your ribs do the same thing. Your pubic bones, where the hip bones come together in the middle, do the same thing. And they've done it through hundreds or thousands of theses and PhDs, dissertations. They've looked at these things. They have created these standards that we use in forensic anthropology to help us figure out how old someone is, what the sex of the individual is. We always use the hip for sex, so for both age and sex of an adult, you use the hip bone. Female, that's a very wide sciatic notch, a very narrow sciatic notch for a male, and there's about 10 or 15 other characteristics on that hip bone that can tell us if it's a male or a female. Males and females are different in the hips. Females actually have larger hips than males do. It's the only part of the human skeleton that's larger for a female than it is for a male. And there's differences in the shape of the skull. The females have what we call a very gracile skull. Males typically are robust. Males have a nice square chin. Females have a rounded or pointed chin. And then we take measurements, 30 or 40 measurements all across the skull. Plug those into a formula, a software package that we have, and it helps us. We also look at ancestry. Ancestry is the hardest thing we do. Why? Because we're all mixed up. We're all mixed up. On the far left, you see an Asian, which represents Mongoloid. Mongoloid, Native American or Indian, whatever they wish to call themselves, includes Eskimo, Native Americans, Native South Americans, Asians. In the center, you have a black individual, African American, whatever that person wishes to call himself or herself. And on the far right, you have Caucasoid or white individual. And there are characteristics, again, that we can measure and just look at the shape of the nasal opening, the shape of the eye orbits, put all those together. But what if you have someone who's an admixture? That's what makes it so hard. Our population is very mixed up. And I like to use myself as an example because I'm both Native American, so I'm Mongoloid, and I'm Caucasoid because I'm Irish, Dutch, German, and Scots. And my students say to me, Miss Manhein, please leave your skull to the lab. They want to see what my skull looks like under this funny little face. I'm going to leave my skull to science or my body to science, but not to the scientists. I don't want to be hanging around that lab forever. But I will leave my body to science. But it's hard. But my point being, I don't make light of it, but it is very hard. I do make light of it, but it's very hard to tell what population. And what about the fact that ancestry is both cultural and biological? You know, some people consider themselves to fit into one group, while others might consider it something else. So it's a very difficult thing that we do. Trauma, we look at three kinds of trauma: antemortem, before death; postmortem, after death; and perimortem, at or around the time of death. That is the trauma that we testify about in court. Typically at or around the time of death, what happened to that person? Can the information that we glean from the bones, and more often than not, it is just bones, though we look at cases that are less than 24 hours old, It's according to what happened to the individual. And we try to determine what happened to that person, and we testify about that in court. So we look at trauma. Here's an example of old trauma, ante-mortem. This is a prosthetic device that's put into this femur, and it can help identify someone, which it did. We look at post-mortem trauma, where this person was run over by a bush hog, and the light-colored bone you see here, that body had been out in a field for many, many years and was stained all dark in color, and the person who was cutting the grass found him. And then there's perimortem at around the time of death, and this is a gunshot wound to the skull right here. And then once we received it, the skull was in many, many different pieces. We put the skull back together again. It's a puzzle. We put that puzzle back together again. We saw and found another gunshot wound here just above the ear hole, which is right there. And that, okay, the pathologist said, okay, so Mary and her group found 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The man still died from a gunshot wound to the head. But another important thing we found when we were looking at the skull, once we cleaned it, and when we got it, when we received it, it had tissue all over it. But once we cleaned it, right here, anterior to the gunshot wound, is blunt force trauma. So this person not only had 2 gunshot wounds to the skull, but also had blunt force trauma to the skull. And if you were serving on a jury, I do believe that would be very significant to you. Very significant to you. So let's go back just a second. So in looking at these bones, when we get them, we try to figure out, how long has it been since this person died? And if it's been very recent and there are insects available, we call on forensic entomologists to help us to try to figure out how long it's been since that person died. One of the foremost forensic entomologists in the country was Dr. Lamar Meek, who was a professor at LSU until his untimely death about 10 or so years ago. Wonderful forensic entomologist. But one of the things that he and his research associate were working on was they were trying to figure out if these insects, particularly blowflies, that we use for forensic markers, lay their eggs at night. Now that can play a significant role in a forensic case if you're talking about hours or days since time of death. So they decided to do a research project on the LSU campus. And so what they did is they went to the local grocery store, Winn-Dixie, Albertsons, whatever you have up here, and they went to the grocery store and they purchased about 8 or 10 whole chickens because these insects will lay their eggs on anything. And they placed them surreptitiously across different parts of the campus at LSU. I love to tell this story to LSU administrators. They openly blanch to think that there are chickens across their campus. Anyway, she would go throughout the night, and I can just see her today. She would go throughout the night checking those chickens. She had placed them in a box. She had tied it up very, very carefully to secure the chicken. And they placed some in the light of the moon, some in artificial light, some in areas that had no light, just to see if these insects would lay their eggs at night. And so she went to check one of her sites, one of the buildings at LSU, which shall remain anonymous, over in the bushes there by that building. The chicken was gone. Now, what did you think? A feral cat, a feral dog, they're all around the campuses. In fact, I have one at my house permanently that I found on campus, one of 3 dogs and 3 cats that somehow or another made their way to my house. I love animals. But in this particular case, she didn't know what had happened. Did a cat get it? Did a dog get it? The string was not broken. She couldn't figure out what happened. So she went back to her ice chest in her truck and got another chicken and put it back in the same place because she was working on a research project. And so what she did is she came back that next week and overheard some women talking in that building about the night watchman who had refused to come to work the week before because only in Louisiana. He thought someone had placed a voodoo curse on him. He had gone about his rounds that night, checking, the building. He saw this chicken in a box. He took the chicken. He came back about an hour later. The chicken had come back. I love this story. That's funny. That's really funny. I'm telling you, truth is so much stranger than fiction, isn't it? And so she had to find this nice man and explain to him that their only interest in chickens was research and lunch. But what they were able to determine is that these insects do not lay their eggs at night. They typically do not lay their eggs in the rain. This was some of their additional research. They do not lay their eggs below 50, 55 degrees. That's very important. So we use a lot of climate data when we're trying to figure out time since death, if it is indeed a recent death. One of the things that we're doing at LSU is that we are building what is, without a doubt, the most comprehensive state database of its kind in the country. What does that mean? For missing and unidentified people, that's where that repository of information comes in. In 2006, we were able to write a law and get it, a bill, and get it passed. It became law. Governor Kathleen Blanco signed it into law, and basically that law is this central database. That law says that, you can just very quickly, in that last paragraph, it basically, to sum it up, means that anytime a case of an unidentified person is found in Louisiana, and if the law enforcement agency knows who that person might be or is working on that case and they have what they call a putative ID, then we don't need to get that case unless they want us to look at it for trauma. But if they have no idea who that person is, and after a reasonable time they can't figure out who that person is, then we need to see that case. We give it back to the law enforcement afterwards, but what we do is that profile, age, sex, ancestry, time since death, and then we take a DNA sample. That DNA sample is taken, hand carried to the Louisiana State Police, where they analyze it. They have quite a few analysts over there, and that profile, that DNA profile, is uploaded into the National CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System. And so you have the opportunity for cold case hits from across the country. If someone who's been missing across the country's data or DNA or family DNA is in the database, there may be a cold case hit. It's the best way in the world to get strangers identified from a community. We've worked on way over 1,000 cases. We have about 100 cases of persons who are unidentified in that database. That doesn't mean they're complete skeletons. It can be a leg bone. It can be a partial skull. So we've collected them from many, many different places. We are literally going to every sheriff's office, every police department, every coroner's office in the state to gather data on these unidentified people. We are also soliciting all cases of missing persons from Louisiana and are putting them in the database, and their families are contributing DNA to be compared to the DNA of unidentifieds already in the database. They believe there are between 12 and 40,000 sets of unidentified human remains in this country. And so we have the opportunity here to have the most complete database in the country. How is that funded? Through your tax dollars, and I thank you most graciously. Our tax dollars fund it. Our services to law enforcement in the state are now all free. All of that is free. There is no fee involved at all. So if you know someone who's missing, you have a friend who's missing, anything like that, I urge you to contact us. What have we been able to do since we started this database? Again, we have the profiles. I'm not even going through those. It's a typical profile. If the person has tattoos, where the person was found, all of these different things. Same thing for the missing people. We're not going to dwell on that. You can go to our database, which is user-friendly, at our website, identifyla for Louisiana.lsu.edu. Everywhere you see a blue dot is just a general location where multiple cases can be found on that database. We also put all of our cases into a national database called NamUs, which is funded through NIJ, the National Institute of Justice. So our cases are in that database too. All kinds of different agencies across the country mine our databases to get our cases, which is great because everybody across the country then sees our cases. In addition to that, and this is just an individual who's missing, in addition to that, in cases where we have unidentified, this is a young man who is unidentified out of New Orleans. This is a facial reconstruction we did on him. His skeleton was found in along Chef Mentor Drive in New Orleans several years ago. So we have, working with Crime Stoppers, we have created a face for him. His profile is there, just a brief one, Crime Stoppers is helping us with this, and there's a reward for any information that leads to who this young man is, and of course the arrest and conviction of the person who did him harm. So we have had some luck with that, not a lot, but we've only done about 7 or 8 of them. We each have a couple up here in this part of the country, I think at least 1 or 2 in the Shreveport area. Facial reconstruction, which is one of the main things we're known for, is something that dates back, this technique dates back way over 100 years. It was used many, many years ago. They were trying to create new images for famous persons like Bach and others. And the technique simply requires that you know what you're doing, first of all, and you put markers that are cut to very specific lengths in millimeters. These are just pencil erasers, but they're cut to precise marks in millimeters, like the tissue, and they're for tissue depth on your face. Like just between your eyes at glabella, what we call glabella, that tissue is only about 4 millimeters thick, generally speaking. We have done all kinds of research projects where we have scanned almost 1,000 people from different ages, from 3 years of age to 90+ years of age, males, females, different ancestries, and have come up with standards, our own standards here in Louisiana, and we've combined those with standards that have been developed across the rest of the country. We've even done them for some Native Americans in Canada. So we have a very large database that we use to base these average tissue depth measurements on, and you you simply build the face back. This is an old case all the way back from 1994. This is a case of a young man whose body floated up in a small boat off the coast of South Louisiana, ended up in the jurisdiction of St. Mary Parish. They believed there was a chance that this young man was from Cuba. The boat was homemade. He obviously had died of dehydration, but the paraphernalia in the boat suggested that indeed he more than likely was from Cuba. They began to search all the records they could find. You can't get anything out of Cuba. They asked us to do a facial reconstruction. This is one of the very first ones we did. Wonderful assistant Eileen Barra did this one. At the time we were using wigs. We no longer use them. But ultimately we were going to put flyers out all over Cuba, but someone came forward. The mother came to Baton Rouge. She recognized everything in the boat as being her son's. He died of dehydration. This is the real image of the young man. It looks a little like him. They might have actually gotten him identified from that, though the image we created didn't get him identified. It was something that prompted the news media to alert different people. This mother came to Louisiana, identified this young man. He was in his late 20s. He is buried in Baton Rouge. The boat that he came here in has been carried all across the United States by the Cuban American Association to demonstrate how much someone still wants to come to America. When he was trying to get from Cuba to Florida, which is what, 90 or so miles, they say. He was 700+ miles off course, when his boat washed up close enough to Louisiana. He had left a family behind in Cuba, a young mother and 2 children behind. People still want to come to America. This is our oldest case so far, 32 years old. This case is 32 years old when we finally got him identified. That was a joy that I cannot explain to you. Follow this timeline. In 1979, this young man was reported missing in western Louisiana. His case went to the coroner's office in Shreveport. Actually, the records didn't go anywhere. His body wasn't found until 79. He and another young man were noted to be missing out of western Louisiana. Let me make sure I have this right. The first young man's body was found not too long after he had died. The other young man's body wasn't found until 1979, 4 years later, and it was simply a skeleton that was found in a dump in western Louisiana. In 1982, the coroner's office in Shreveport submitted it to us. I was still a fairly new student there in the graduate program at that time. In 2005, before the law was passed in 2006, we had enough money from some grants I had received to submit his DNA. So we put his DNA in the National CODIS database. Nothing happened. I was going to Shreveport in 2006 to do a workshop up there, and I thought, what is an old case we've had forever that we have not gotten identified? Let's do a new facial reconstruction on him, which is what this is. Take it to Shreveport. I just have this great feeling, I'm always optimistic, that someone will recognize this case and swoop him away and take him home after all those years. Well, I took it to Shreveport. I talked to the law enforcement people, probably about 50 to 100 people. Not a one of them knew anything about it. They didn't remember anything, and they wouldn't have necessarily remembered anything, and most of them probably hadn't even been born or out of diapers when this case was first found. So I came back very disappointed, set that facial reconstruction, that 3D facial reconstruction on the counter in the lab, and Detective Davidson came. Robo Davidson came one day, and he was talking with me about an entirely different case, and he looked at this three-dimensional clay facial reconstruction, and it was sitting over in the corner, and he said, "Mary, what's that?" And I explained to him, you know, how in a roundabout way we'd acquired it from Shreveport, and nothing had happened in all those years. And I said, "Why?" He said, "The words we love to hear." He said, "He looks familiar to me. That's all we're looking for. It doesn't have to be a spot-on ID, just so it catches someone's attention." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he began to tell me the story of a young man named Antonio Barajas and his friend who came to Western Louisiana. Both disappeared. Friend found fairly early on. Barajas still missing. I said, "Why would this look familiar to you after all this time?" He says, "I'm working on a new website for the sheriff's office, and I just saw his picture the other day, and something about his image struck me." I said, "Get out of here, get back there, find that family, find that family." So he went back. It took him a while to find the family. Finally, he was able to find, because the records, of course, were all gone. They were long gone, most of them. Finally found the family in West Texas. I think he did some advertising over there. The mother was still alive. She was 90-something years old. I think she may still be alive today. The siblings were still alive. Took their DNA. It matched perfectly to this young man, Antonio Barajas. And we sent Antonio home after 32 years. That is amazing, isn't it? It really is. There's no feeling like it in the world. This is why we do what we do. We've had case after case. This is a case we do work out of state all the time. This is a case some of you may be familiar with. In 1973, the remains of 27 young teenage boys, victims of a serial killer, were found in Texas, and 24 of the victims were identified fairly quickly. 3 of them remained unidentified. So look how long it's been. In 2007, in Houston, Texas, asked us if we would do facial reconstructions on the remaining 3. We did. Soon after they were posted, a young woman came forward and said, "That is my younger brother." That was the oldest photo she had of him. It is an amazing likeness to this image. It really is. And she said, "I know that's my brother. I know it is." DNA cleared it up, sent him home. And since then, the other 2 have been identified. So all 27 of these victims of that awful person who died in prison, I'm so sad to say, have been identified. This is just a little bit about how it works. This young man was identified, but not through the image. But this just shows you, first we do it in clay, and then we work with it on Photoshop. So we didn't know that this young man had a mustache. We never touched them up once we finished them. I will not allow that. And so we just gave him 2 different hairdos in Photoshop. We gave him some short hairdo, and then a mustache. And then, because so many young men like to shave their heads these days, we did this. And it looks very similar to this young man, but it was not our image that did it. It was not our image that did it. He got identified by other means. But you can create these images that look very similar to the persons they are. This is one out of Orleans Parish. Before the law was passed, they had it for a year. They were going to bury her as an unidentified. Remember, the law was passed in 2006. They had every right to bury her as an unidentified. And many of these cases out there in the wilderness in the U.S. have been cremated too, so some of them will never be identified. But in this case, we created this image. They put it on television. The very next day, her friend called and said, "That's my friend Kathy. I know it is. There's just something about it. I think it looks a lot like Kathy." But her friend noticed it immediately. That's all we're looking for. It doesn't have to be a complete replica of this person or an absolute. Some of you may be familiar with the case of Precious Doe out of Kansas City. This is an FBI case. I worked with the FBI on this case. I went to Kansas City. This is a young child whose body was found in one place, and her head was found hundreds of yards away. Tragic case. We created this image for them. We were also asked to give them a closer age range on her. They had her age anywhere between 3 and 9. Then they had it 3 to 7. And I knew that working with Dr. Robert Barsley of the LSU Dental School in New Orleans, who's been working with me since the 80s, I knew Bob and his cohorts could get that age a lot closer. Sure enough, I went up there, we exhumed her body, I brought her skull back to Louisiana, took it to the dental school, and they pinpointed her age. They said she's probably not over 4, closer to 3.5. Again, what were they looking at? They were looking at the growth and development of her teeth. We did the image for them. It was posted all over the news media for months and months. It was not what got her identified, but this is the image of the little girl. Her name is Erica Michelle Maria Green. She has 3 given names, and this is what continued to draw attention to it. The reason she has this hairdo is the hairdo she had at autopsy. Eileen Barra did this image for our lab, and I didn't show her the autopsy photo until after she had already created the face. So that is the exact hairdo the little child had had. That little child was so loved. She was taken care of by a family friend. The mother had been in trouble, got into prison, got out of prison, and the stepfather killed the child. They are both in prison now. He is in there for life. This is one of those old cases. This one, I find it truly amazing that we got it identified. This was in 1990. A body was found in a truck stop down in South Louisiana, in Hammond, Louisiana. A man comes out of the cafe truck stop about midnight or so, sees a body lying out there in the cafe parking lot. The face is gone, the viscera are gone. There's hardly anything left of this man. His hips are still there, his legs are almost dragged away, but he was covered in tattoos. I got this case about a week after it was found. The law enforcement called me and said, Mary, can y'all do anything with this? We don't have any idea who this man is, but he's got tattoos all over his body. So I took some students with me. At the time, I had no one working with me except a couple of graduate students, and I kept looking for someone who could draw. I can't draw, so I knew I wouldn't be much help. And so I found one who was willing to go and look at this body in this outdoor storage area that had been out there for a week. And so we got out there, and he was able, we did some calculations, we looked at his hip bone, we took a piece of the hip bone and a couple of other pieces that had to be removed because he was all broken up. But he drew the tattoos. This is the tattoo that did it. This tattoo on the right was a very large tattoo, about this high, and it covered most of his entire back. And it's one of those images. Can't you just see this? This looks like seaweed in her hair almost. It looks like one of the sirens who called to Jason and the Argonauts in the old myths and stories from long, long ago. So she looks like a sea nymph almost. And he had nautical tattoos all over his body. I thought, this man was a sailor. I just know he was a sailor who sailed the 7 seas. Well, they had fingerprints. He had only been dead a few hours when he was found, but all of this was destroyed, so they couldn't identify him. And this was before DNA. This was 1990, before they did anything with DNA. And so we kept him, and we kept him, and we kept him. About 2 years ago, a young woman called our lab, and she said, I just talked to someone in Mississippi where you gave a talk, and I called because we've been looking for my uncle for more than 20 years. And I asked the people in Mississippi, because I've seen so much on television about getting people identified, if they had a database, because the last time our uncle was heard from was in Mississippi one night. And she said, the people in Mississippi said they don't have a database, but Louisiana does. And so she said, I called you, and she says, I'm going through these images in your database, and one of them, I think, is my uncle. She says, my mother said my uncle disappeared such and such time during 1990, last heard from in Mississippi, and that he had a great big old tattoo on his back. She didn't know what it was, but it was a woman, she thinks. A face of a woman it was her brother. That's all she could remember. She said, but we firmly believe that that is my uncle. I said, was he in the Navy? And she said, yes, he was. And why fingerprints never were able to track him, we don't know. Some of these fingerprints on different cases are being rerun through the national database now, and they are getting hits on them. But in this case, it didn't happen. But we were able to get him identified. They sent their DNA in, And there he is. He was a sailor. They allowed us to use these photos. There he was as a young man. There he didn't change much through time, did he? And they said he loved to travel. He traveled from Florida to Mississippi to Texas all the time. And when his body was found, it was one day, less than a day actually, after he had last talked to them from Mississippi. So the DNA database works. The people are looking at it. It's a marvelous example of how these kinds of things can help put families back in touch with their loved ones. We've even done an age progression for the New York Post on John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This we did a few years ago in 2003. Wow, I can't believe that it's been 10 years. Is this 2013? Barely. This is November. Where is time going? But the New York Post called us and asked us if we would do an age progression on John Fitzgerald Kennedy to coincide with his assassination. And we said, sure, we'll take on anything. And I thought it would be fun. So Eileen did this image of him. But at the time, Senator Ted Kennedy was still alive, and he had a very puffy hairdo. And Eileen said, well, you know, they were brothers. John Fitzgerald Kennedy probably would have had a fairly raised hairdo. I said, no, no, no. No, no, you're not putting that much hair on John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I will not allow it. And so she shortened his hairdo. We rarely disagree, by the way. She shortened his hairdo, and this is the image that people call from all over the world. Germany especially wanted to buy it from us, but we'd already sold it to the New York Post. It was a contract with them. But interestingly enough, a few weeks after this surfaced on the cover of the New York Post, Senator Ted Kennedy changed his hairdo. So maybe somebody has influence over the U.S. Senate. We did an age regression on Martha Washington. We sent her back in time. This is for a cover of a book. This is the cover of the biography about Martha Washington. It's a really good book. This is an image that they have of Martha, and they believe this is really Martha. This is another image that many have said is Martha. We're not sure that is Martha. These two images do not really look like the same person to me. But they wanted us to regress her, to send her backwards in time. So we sent her backwards to about 20 years of age. We made her a lot thinner. She was truly a beautiful woman. And then they enhanced it even more. Notice how attractive, you might say, that she is on the cover of this book. My point being, you can do anything with computers these days, as we all know. Does this look much like her? Who knows? We'll never know. These last two cases I want to chat with you briefly about, and then I'd like to take some questions. Ancient Egypt, what do we think of? We think of mummies, don't we? Mummies, all the pyramids, all these different things. Well, when I think of ancient Egypt, I often think of Boris Karloff, all those mummies, those movies I grew up with, you know, Shock Theater on Saturday night. I'm sure some of you must have experienced that. Well, there is a mummy down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at what's called the LASM Museum, the Louisiana Art and Science Museum. When my kids in the 80s were very, very young, we used to go down there and look at that mummy through the glass, and I would just imagine all kinds of wonderful tales about that mummy. Well, recently, in the last couple of years or so, they were building a new exhibit for that mummy in the new museum they have there, and they asked me if we would like to look at it. We could X-ray it and tell them about it. Well, that mummy came to Louisiana in the 1960s from a museum in Pennsylvania that had gone defunct, had become defunct. And so all they knew about it was she was called the Princess of Thieves. That's all they knew. The history was lost totally. Well, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the 1920s, maybe early 30s, the elite across this country would have mummy unwrapping parties. They would call everyone together and have a party and unwrap these mummies. About 100 mummies came to this country from Egypt and other areas during those times, and I think that's probably where they got the idea for the mummy movies, the Mummy's Revenge, all of those. Mummies always get revenge, if you've noticed. And so this mummy might have come then, but this is the Princess of Thieves, and as we saw her in the museum, and so we carted her off to my museum. They said there was only one thing, my lab, they said there was only one thing I couldn't do. I couldn't actually touch her. Oh my, I did touch her, by the way, but they said, just a couple of times. They want us to X-ray her and tell us everything they could tell, that we could tell them about her, because all they knew was that she was a Princess of Thieves. And we had a wonderful Egyptologist, Dr. Jonathan Elias from Pennsylvania, who helped us with the project. And so we carted her off to our museum, and it was believed that she was between 2,000 and 2,500 years old. I've worked on skeletons that are over 6,000 years old, but never a true Egyptian mummy. And they always called her the Princess of Thebes, and Dr. Elias said she's definitely from the Theban era and that region because of all the hieroglyphs on her wonderfully preserved cartonnage, this area here. This is linen, and then this is made of linen, and it's sewn to the linen that's covering her. And so what did we find out about her? So just X-raying her, that's all they allowed me to do. And there's her chest plate up close. You can see these wonderful hieroglyphs. So Jonathan Elias talked a lot about them, and he just said that mainly it surely indicates that she's from Thebes. She's somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 years old. So they wanted us to do our forensic profile on her, which is always fun because it's not a murder case. You know, it's not somebody who's going to be sad. It's not tragic. It's just a mummy. So the biological profile then. Well, our greatest discovery is that the she is a he. All these years they've said that it was a princess of Thebes. And what we were able to tell them by looking at the hips, remember, that's the best thing. So we're simply using our forensic anthropology techniques to be able to show that indeed they have something very special here, but the she is a he. The pelvic inlet, clearly only a male. This is a pubic bone region, clearly only a male. The subpubic angle, clearly only a male. So it screams male to us as forensic anthropologists. All of this we discovered with an X-ray. The mastoid process, which is behind your ear, a big knot behind your ear if you feel it. You can't really see it in this X-ray. It's two-dimensional, but there's a mastoid process there. Very male. Square or everted gonion, this region at the back of the jaw, very male. Chin, very male. So we didn't have to do any scientific analysis. We didn't have to take any samples from this mummy to be able to tell that indeed it was a male. So if you get down there to Baton Rouge, it's right there by the USS Kidd. So go to that museum if you want to. So what else? So we said, okay, it's a male. What about age? We looked at the teeth. The third molars were well developed. There's the wisdom teeth. I've never understood why they think at 18 these should be the wisdom teeth, but that's a whole different story. These are the medial clavicles, your collarbone. There's a little growth area that fuses about 25 or 26. It's all fused, so probably minimum of 18, at least 25 or 26. A little space right here in the sacrum near the tailbone, not quite fused, under 30, so somewhere between 18 and 30, we think he's probably around 25 years of age or so. So that's so many things you can do just by looking at an X-ray. What about his health status? Well, this is what he looks like up close. And this is not at all unusual. If you haven't seen any mummies up close, go and see that mummy. He's a great mummy. But this is what he looked like in great condition. This is what his teeth looked like. His teeth were in wonderful condition. Remember, he's 2,500 years old. And if you look at his teeth, they're very heavily worn, not at all unusual. Even today, Egyptians are what are called bread eaters. They are autophagians, and bread has a lot of grit in it. It slowly wears the teeth down. So even though he's not very old, his teeth have quite a lot of wear on them because of his diet. He had a lot of grit in the grains in the bread that he ate. He has a little tiny white line in his tibia. It just says that he had an interruption in growth when he was developing. Nothing, really. We all have those. Look at his hair. Dr. Elias, the Egyptologist, says it's very rare for mummies to have hair. And you see the curls? This is the Grecian influence in Thebes at the time. That's why I believe people thought it was a female, the curls. Women wore their hair long. They didn't wear their hair short. These are male curls. And almost no mummies that came to the U.S. have hair. They just don't have them. They take them off. Where do they take it off? In the Mummy Museum. Trauma, ante-mortem, before death. So we're doing the same thing with a profile. None. Post-mortem, after death, none. Perimortem, extensive perimortem trauma on that mummy. Everywhere you see a red arrow, he has a broken rib. Everywhere you see a red arrow is a break in his ribs. I think there's 20 or so of them, if I recall. Now, This could only come, first of all, it was not at all unusual for graves to be looted all the time in Egypt. That was very common back then. They would often tear open the cartonnage, take the jewels, anything that might be in there, the scarabs. But if you recall, there was nothing wrong, nothing at all wrong with his cartonnage, his beautiful covering over his body. And so one might expect there to be some damage if something like that had happened, but his cartonnage is not damaged, and you would not see this crushed chest. We call this a flail chest. Something crushed his chest, either front to back or side to side, and popped those ribs. He could have been run over by a chariot. This is 2,500 years ago, you guys. He could have been stomped on by an elephant. He could have fallen from a horse. He could have fallen from a high scaffold. You name it, for whatever you think it could be that. But he has extensive peri-mortem trauma across his body. They didn't know any of this before. All they knew is that it was a princess of Thebes. You can see the cartonnage is not damaged. He's in the same cartonnage. By the way, I did touch his toes. Burial preparation. They had mummies. They had mummy factories back then. They had technicians who rolled them through, just like in maybe an autopsy today, or where they're preparing someone for burial. They would take out the brain. They would take an iron hook, run it up into the head, and squish it around some, and the brain would come out. They would take out most organs. Sometimes they would leave the heart, but they would take out most organs, and they would stick all kinds of things in there to dry the mummy out. So that was what was commonly done, and they had factories. They had these little tables they ran them through. He wasn't prepared like that at all. The organs are typically removed, his are not. The limbs are typically wrapped individually, his are not. His brain is still there. They didn't take out his brain. He has multiple organs that are still there. They didn't take out his organs. They didn't wrap his limbs individually. A most unusual discovery that we found. This makes this mummy probably unique. Everywhere you see a yellow arrow is a reed like a fishing pole almost. Somebody created some type of EMS stretcher for him, emergency medical stretcher for him, and they placed him on this stretcher. You see these white lines that come down through here like this? These are all something like fishing poles, we would call them today, perhaps. And those are reeds. So he has been laid on a mat that is strung together, wrapped together with, it has reeds on it and then it's strapped together. So he was carried from somewhere, a long distance. He was very important, I would think. He had enough honor or enough pull, you might say, enough class, whatever you want to call it. He was important enough to the people surrounding him. They carried him home. I believe this is what happened. They carried him home on that stretcher, and he was already, of course, too far dried out, you might say. He was too desiccated, because that takes place very quickly in those types of climates. He was too desiccated to do the usual mummification, to take out the brain, to take out the organs. The end result was that they just wrapped everything up in that linen and sent him on to glory. What he looked like, this is what we do. You ready? All right. Remember, I couldn't touch him, but we had the X-ray of him, so we moved his mouth up. His mouth was open, and we moved it up and closed it. That's just, he just happened to die like that. That doesn't mean anything. The muscles relax. You go in and out of rigor, or rigor, some people call it. So all we had was this. So we've done two-dimensional drawings before. So you ready to see what he looks like? I think I'm in love. I have no idea if he really looks that way. And does it really matter in the real world? No, it does not. But this is our idea of what he might have looked like in real life. No one will ever know for certain. It's not a forensic case. We don't have to worry about that. So he has been sent back to his new display at the museum. There he is. I think he's a little too far away from the public. You can't get close enough to see all the details. And then along with the display are some of the accoutrements that might have been representative of some of those that might have followed him on his way to glory. So one last project that I want to just quickly mention to you. So it's so wonderful to be able to be engaged occasionally in these projects that don't require or that don't have anything to do with modern cases. So we get to do a lot of historic cases. In this particular case, This has to do with the USS Monitor, and I know that many of you, if not all of you, know what the USS Monitor is. When I was first approached about this case, all I could remember was some kind of ship that did something in the Civil War. That's all I could remember. Then someone said, well, Monitor and Merrimack. I said, oh yeah, somebody fought somebody else. You know, I didn't remember much of that Civil War history. Well, in 1862, the North wanted to develop their ironclad. And when they developed the ironclad, it forever changed the way that battle at sea would occur, because before it had been mainly the wooden boats. But they commissioned an ironclad, and this is the ironclad called Monitor that they commissioned. They set to working on it way back in 61, launched it in January of 62. It ended up in a battle with what was called at the time the Virginia, which was at one point the Merrimack, and the South had control of that, and they changed it into an ironclad. So you had two ironclads going against one another. There are those who say Monitor won. There are those who say that Merrimack or Virginia won. Today, I don't think it really matters. They both limped away. The interesting or intriguing part to this story, though, is the fact that look at what happened to Monitor. Monitor was being towed to shore on December the 31st, 1862, off the coast of North Carolina, and it tipped over. There were 59 sailors and officers on board. 16 disappeared. The others were saved. The location of Monitor off the coast of North Carolina has been known since the 1970s, 76, I believe. In 2002, they decided to raise part of that. They had already raised the engines, I think, but they decided to raise the gun turret. This is what Monitor looked like. Isn't that it looks like a submarine, doesn't it? And this is the gun turret. It's about 20 or so feet across, and it has cannons that point out from those holes, and then you go below to live. This is what it looks like. It's sitting in hundreds of feet of water off the coast of North Carolina today. It looks kind of like, it reminds you of what the Titanic might look like. This is what it looks like. It tipped over at that point. And so they pulled out part of the engine, and in 2002, they pulled up the gun turret. And this is what the gun turret looks like that has those cannons in it. They took out the cannons. You can see these are called Dahlgren guns. Conservators in there digging around all, and this was full of muck, all kinds of coal and debris from the ocean floor. So it was like an anaerobic environment. And why would I be interested in it? Inside, they found 2 human skeletons in the gun turret. Texas A&M faculty and others are part of this foundation that they've launched this inquiry into who these sailors could be. So they call them, this is what the Dahlgren gun looks, in great condition, just very quickly. Here you see them excavating. I wish we'd been able to help with that. There's a human bone right there in the middle of all that muck. That cold water and all of that anaerobic environment helped to preserve 2 sets of human remains. Who are they? They have no idea. 16 men disappeared that day. 2 have been found. These are some of the other things they found in the gun turret. They found boots, a ring, a navy button, I think that's a knife, a shoe, silverware, interesting. There's the ring up close. There's where they found it, right inside the muck. See, this is like thick sludge, anaerobic environment. Comb, that looks like a comb today, doesn't it? Shoe, there's some of the sailors. There were both blacks and whites on that. They think the 2 men, or we believe the 2 men that were found are both white. There were some black sailors on there too. There's some of the officers. By the way, the officers did not mingle with the sailors. They only talked to themselves. This is one of my favorite shots. Look at him, 1 step, and he's toast. This doesn't want to show it, but you can see him. He's very near the edge. And one more step, and he's over. So the officers would stand around like this. This gun turret, though, look at this, the construction of it. Now that's a ship. So we determined that they delivered models of the real skulls to us. They were processed in Hawaii at what's called JPAC these days. JPAC, it used to be called SILHI, and that's the forensic laboratory over there that deals with soldiers from the various wars, Vietnam, World War II, Korean War. And so they determined that the two men, one was about 30 or so, we think he's about 32, and one was 17 to 24, we think he's closer to early 20s. They sent models of the skull. So all we had were models of the real skull, which is all we needed, because these were printed, these were scanned with all this wonderful new equipment and printed. And we can do that at our lab too. We have that type of equipment. So we built the faces of those two men. We reconstructed them. This was the older one, younger one. This is the older one. This is the image. So they wanted to present these at the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Hampton Roads. So they had a big ceremony in Washington, and we went up there and gave a presentation. This is the older of the two. They wanted the three-dimensional images. And then this is what he looked like when we made him look more lifelike. We gave him a beard, because maybe 32-year-old, 30-year-old might wear a beard. This is the younger of the two. Image we came up with, and they're advertising these all across the country. In fact, one of my chapters in my new book, Bone Remains, is about this project, and they have excerpted that chapter and put, which I'm very excited about, and put in the Museum of Natural History's magazine that just came out a few days ago, so I was very excited about that. They're excited about the potential. This is the younger one with a facial image used, we use Photoshop on that. So these were sent to Washington. UPS hand-carried these literally to Washington for this whole process. And then we scanned them and printed them because we wanted our own images. These are images being printed. This is one of my assistants working on printing them. This is the image that you see from the clay. And this is how they were sent to Washington in these special carrying cases that UPS helped us with. UPS said 100 people worked on this. Interesting when you want to do something, how well it gets done. And this is just what they looked like in Washington when we presented them. And so we get to work on projects that are both historic in nature, not only forensic in nature, but historic in nature also. So we're a resource for education, research, and public service.